to win in the battlefield is not enough. True victory lies in the hearts and minds of the public. It is the first and last frontier of any conflict, and if they are not won, no matter how many battles you win, you will lose the war. Hello everyone, and welcome to this Dominion War special on propaganda. Propaganda is something that we don't really see much of in the actual series, but it almost certainly was the case that propaganda was a very substantial part of the war effort, as it is with any war effort, both modern and far in the past. Propaganda is a key part of not only legitimizing a war effort, but also in driving public support and cementing the gains that you are perceived to have made during the war. It's perfectly possible that at the time a war is regarded as a victory or as a defeat, but then over a longer span of time, as public perception changes, the view of the war itself may change. So, what are we going to be looking at today? Well, today we're going to be looking at the way the media operates among the various combatants of the Dominion War. We'll be breaking that down. We'll be looking at how they cover stories, what kind of stories they prefer, what kind of spin they put on it, how it all works and comes together. So without any further ado, let's get into it. So let's just go through the various powers. We have the Federation, who operate a free press. You have Cardassia, which has a state-run media. In the Klingon Empire, the media is actually just state-sponsored, and there is a key difference. And then in the Romulan Empire, the media is state-controlled, and actually again that's very different to a state-run media. The Dominion themselves don't really have a specific media division, but if you want to talk of propaganda, you can definitely see it in Dominion publicity efforts, but that's very different from a full-blown, media network. They don't really have much of that themselves. So let's first ask the question, why is media and propaganda important? You need to reassure the public, you need to show returns on investment, you need to dictate a narrative, you need to tell a story, you have to make sense of this colossal thing that is war. War is enormous and complicated, and the causes of war are themselves enormous and complicated, and it's very difficult for the average mind, or really anyone, to make sense of why you might be at war. So you have to give them a good reason why you're at war, something simple and understandable. And you also want to use it to demoralize the enemy, or, to reassure your allies. So propaganda does have definitely a foreign element as well as just being used for your own public. And again, that means selling the war abroad. If you want to win allies, you want to get allies in on your side, you've got to sell the war. Or if you're getting aid from certain groups, you need to show that you are using this aid properly, and it is making a difference. They have to feel like they are making a difference and benefiting from supplying you and not your enemies. And if you don't, you will lose the war even if you win. Wars are expensive in terms of prosperity and in lives. And it's very easy for a war to feel like a defeat even if it's a victory, if you don't follow through and explain to people why the world is a better place for them having sacrificed so much. So that's why, again, even after a war is over, you need to keep up with the propaganda and the narratives. And this is to say that propaganda does not have to be outright lying or deception. Propaganda is just a certain way of framing reality. Lying is always going to be harder than telling the truth. But just because you have to tell the truth does not mean you have to tell the whole truth. People can only think of a handful of things at a time. So let's say you have a defeat on one front and a victory on another. Well, think about which of those you would rather sell, because people can only really think about one thing at a time. And if you push one of those stories and don't push that other one, people will probably ignore the one where you don't look so good. So story selection is incredibly important, or critically, what you don't select. However, there is a caveat to that. Whatever you don't talk about, your enemy might talk about, and in that way, you give up a narrative. So let's say you don't talk about the defeat, you talk about the victory, but the enemy talks about your defeat, and they say, oh yeah, but they took way more casualties, they did terribly, their entire force was wiped out. Now, if you had taken more of a front foot on that particular situation, and perhaps you said, actually, no, we'll talk about the defeat because it's an excellent example of holding out to the last man and really fighting to their last, and it's a real show of, courage and determination. The enemy can talk about their glorious victory all they like, but you've said, but we've told a better story, haven't we? Because, yeah, the enemy won because they had overwhelming odds. People don't like overwhelming odds. People don't care about that. People want to hear about the scrappy underdog, and we've given them a scrappy underdog story there. And it's like, well, if that's what we're like when we're the underdog, where we're outgunned and overpowered, what can we do when we have equal footing? Who looks like the better fighter now? So, it's all about presentation. And when you're doing presentation, you need to ask, who is this going to be for? Who are you aiming at? Is it a domestic audience? Is it a foreign audience? Is it aimed at recruitment? Is it aimed at public morale? These are all things that you really need to think about. What is its goal? What are you trying to do with this propaganda? Not all propaganda is intended to do the same thing. There's a wide variety of purposes for which various forms of propaganda exist, and they're not all trying to do the same thing. Each combatant in the Dominion War has its own priorities and strategic position, and so they're actually all approaching propaganda very differently and putting very different emphases on what does work for them and, what doesn't work for their enemies. What's a good story to tell which makes us look good and them look bad. So indeed, that might even vary between how the Federation likes to portray the Dominion, this overwhelming force of evil, which is just, so enormous and scary, and, they're coming for you, and, but it means every time they defeat the Dominion, they can say, look how good we are, we defeated this big scary force. Contrast that with, say, the Cardassians. They can't really say that the Cardassians are this big, overwhelming force of evil. In that way, the Cardassians are a bit of an underdog. So what do you say? You say, they're not really well led, they're poorly equipped. You try and make them feel almost pity for the Cardassians. And, don't try and play up the glorious victories. Say, what are these guys doing in the war? Come on, man, you're not meant to, you shouldn't be here. So there's very different ways of portraying the war and portraying your opponents. It doesn't all need to be the same. Right, so let's look at different approaches to propaganda. So with regard to the Cardassians, it is very much a domestic-focused propaganda effort, and the main goal here is to drive recruitment. While, of course, in reality, the Cardassians are just operating on a basis of conscription, it's good if it can kind of give the illusion or perception of sort of, patriotism and zeal and all of that, rather than people actually just being dragged into the Cardassian military, whether they like it or not. And that served to then further reassure the citizenry that, yes, my boy's going off to war, and, he's really behind it, and, all the young, it's all the young boys, they're all about it, and they're all, feel that patriotic zeal. And it's also there to help emphasize strength and security, that we are in control of this situation, and, we are the ones kind of dictating how events are going and have complete control. That reassures particularly a populace that is used to a strong authoritarian state. Doesn't matter so much, say, in the Federation that the state presents itself as being in control, because it's not an authoritarian state. It doesn't have to be in control. Now, the Dominion do have a very interesting propaganda effort. Dominion propaganda is very much outwardly focused. Their goal is to go to other governments in the Alpha and Beta Quadrant and sell the cause. sell the cause. You want to win over those neutral powers and show strength and prudence and professionalism. We're a good power. We're a good ally to have. And you want to be with us, because look at how we're persecuting this war. Look how well we're doing. And you want to dictate the narrative in those neutral states. You want to say, well, this is how we're fighting the war, and look, here's our evidence. I'll go into that particular methodology of how they do that. With the Federation, it's very much an internally focused propaganda effort, at least initially. Later on in the war, they would definitely transition to a more external focus, but there's two key purposes. So the first is public information. So while the idea of projecting security and control is not necessarily as important for the Federation, the importance of politicians showing that they are being proactive in some way is still very important. So, for example, use public information to say, yes, well, this is what we do in the event of a Dominion attack. Regardless of whether or not a Dominion attack does happen, it at least reassures you that the people in power are considering the possibility. It's not a nice thing to consider, it's a very scary thing to consider, but it's far better to know that people are thinking about it than they're just completely ignoring it. And in that way, you look like, you're doing something and you're getting out ahead of any potential situation. The other thing is to do it for some recruitment. Starfleet remained a volunteer force throughout the Dominion War, so recruitment was very much an important thing. Although it was done very differently, they weren't certainly going for a broad spectrum of people. Recruitment was generally quite specialised if they were looking for people with certain sets of skills that wouldn't normally come to Starfleet. And then the other thing is to, particularly in the Federation, cover for and sell your allies. The Federation is allied with the Klingons and the Romulans, two of their oldest enemies. It's fair to say that the Federation public is not going to be easily sold necessarily on this, particularly with the reputation that both of these powers have for their, how shall we say, loose interpretation of rules of engagement. And so there's an enormous amount of effort that's got to go in to say, no, the Klingons aren't like that. Look at General Martok. Look at this guy. He's really great. He's got one eye, and he's tough, and he's getting stuck in, and he's professional. He's not this evil barbarian, bloodthirsty guy. He's a clever, crafty tactician. And then that also goes back to how you then look at history as well. You don't emphasize some commanders. So, for example, maybe in, if you're making a holo film about, something during the 23rd century, maybe you don't have a core type Klingon, someone who's very ruthless and bloodthirsty and all that. You have someone like General Chang, someone who's sort of honourable and professional and, well-educated and well-to-do sort of thing. You just slightly change how you present them in the broader media, and you sort of encourage those kind of presentations. Now, that does neatly bring us on to the Klingons and how they sold the war. I mean, they're Klingons. War is kind of their thing. The key thing was to drive recruitment, and critically, you wanted to get the best and brightest for yourself. So, if you're in charge of ground troops, you want the best and brightest to join the infantry. Or if you're in charge of fighter divisions, you want to get the best and brightest into fighter division. There's all different kinds of ways that the Klingons are recruiting, but generally, again, they are recruiting everyone. Everyone is a potential recruit, and we want all of them, but we want to snag the best and brightest. Who are the people with the most get up and go? Those are the ones we want. There was also a key importance in controlling the narrative, telling good, compelling stories about the war, and then also, critically, and the Klingons had to do this many times during the Dominion War, turn defeat into glory. So even if you've been defeated, even if you've been absolutely crushed, you still sell it as a story of heroism and courage and honor and glory. Finally, we have the Romulans. And the Romulan approach was basically to minimize discussion of the war altogether, because they were terrified of looking bad and suffering a defeat. So if you shout a victory one day, well, you might have to cry about a defeat another day. And if you don't cry about the defeat, well, people are going to work it out pretty quickly because you've stopped shouting about victories. So rather than, do in-depth discussion of a war, which people aren't all that keen on anyway, it's not like the Romulan public is 100% behind the Dominion War. They don't really know why they should have to stick their necks out for the old enemy, the Federation, and the creatures that they call Klingons. So there's less of an interest in showing the war in a broad scale. And also, Cardassia was previously a great ally of the Romulans. They had an awful lot in common, regard each other as kindred. So, you're also trying to ask people to support a war against a people who are very similar to them. They're very, very similar and live very similar lives. So, again, that's a bit of a problem. So instead of that, you emphasize individual acts of bravery. You don't talk about numbers. You don't mention numbers. You don't mention, casualties or territory taken. You just talk about individual acts of excellence and bravery. Look at this. Look at this warbird. And he's come in and he's defeated, 3 Dominion battle cruisers all on his own. That's something you can sell and talk about and, that the public will take. But you just talk about these things in isolation. And you don't give them the ability to understand how the war is going more broadly. Because then you could look bad. Ultimately, you're trying to win the public's approval for a war effort that they aren't really behind it to begin with. So you've got to kind of change their mind entirely. Or at least persuade them that it's going well enough that they shouldn't worry. Okay, so that now brings us to methodology. So both the Cardassians and the Romulans basically make use of direct state propaganda and information bureaus. They're effectively state-distributed and state-created propaganda. With Cardassians, they're very keen on posters. The Romulans, as I say, they sort of minimize it, but you might get a newsreel. It's going to be subtle. It's going to be sort of, little bits here and there. With the Cardassians, by contrast, it's everywhere. The war is the world, and the world is the war. And, this is a life and death struggle for Cardassia. Romulans, not so much like that. Okay, with the Federation, basically what they do is they use freelance or investigative journalists. Now, these are great. They go really in depth and they have a high amount of trust among the public. The trouble is, they're very hard to control. In terms of the amount of control that the state has over the media, obviously there is some control because it's a time of war. So the state can't fully suppress a story. It can only say, well, you can't release it yet because it's, dangerous to operational security. They can do that and they can use that to delay, but you can only play that card for so long. If there's something that makes you look bad and it has nothing to do with operational security, it just makes you look bad, you're going to have to let them release it at some point. So they've released a story that makes us look very bad, or our allies looking very bad. What about this story? This story makes us look really good, or it makes the Dominion look really bad. So that's something they could use. And, freelance journalists, they also have the advantage that they're not tied to the state. So, if a freelance Federation journalist stays behind when the Dominion invade in order to get an inside perspective of what life is like in the Dominion, well, the Dominion can't take him prisoner because he's just a civilian, even if they know that he is a journalist. Of course, if he is a journalist, they will definitely make efforts to everyone look tidy around him, don't do any war crimes while he's around. But it definitely does grant them an awful lot more freedom, although getting sort of journalists embedded into the fleet was not necessarily an easy thing to do. There was also a lot of friction and a lot of arguing over it. Ultimately, journalists would be embedded with Starfleet units because it was determined that's the best way to show the war effort. And it varies. So, for example, if you're covering the early Federation retreats during the Dominion War, well, if you show the on-the-ground perspective of the crews, that's not great, because they're all going to say, why are we retreating? Why are we retreating? This sucks. What you say instead is you go, okay, well, let's go to Admiral Ross. Let's get an interview with Admiral Ross. Let's publish that, because he'll say, well, no, this is all very much going according to a certain plan. We have this planned out. I can't tell you, everything, but we're doing a very good job of running the Dominion around, tiring them out, slowing them down, weakening them, and preparing for our own counterattack. So, again, it's who do you talk to, who do you show? Then that brings us, of course, to the Dominion, who made use of independent observers. So basically you bring in independent third-party journalists from other states, and they were very happy to bring them on board Jem'Hadar battle cruisers and basically show them at the, here we are at the cutting edge of the war. You're at the tip of the spear, and we can show them how professional the Jem'Hadar are, how clinically we are pursuing this war. This is what modern war can look like, and, this isn't like Klingons or Romulans where lots of people get horribly murdered. This is just clean and clinical, and we're just going right after Starfleet. We're not hesitating, we're not stopping, we're not here to oppress civilians or terrorize populations. We are here to defeat the enemy militarily, and that is what we are going to do. Now, when it comes to the Klingons, so this is an interesting situation. So the state basically owns the story, if you like. So obviously all Klingon ships make regular reports to High Command of what happens. They now own this story. The state will then offer this out to various Klingon bards who will basically submit various songs in order to talk about this glorious victory or this defiant last stand or whatever it was. And that was commonly the way that it was done. Some bards had been a bit more experimental, making operas, plays, holofilms. Interestingly, the Ferengi made decisive inroads during the Dominion War into Klingon propaganda markets, because the Ferengi came along and said, we're going to produce holosuite programs. You can be in the Battle of Arcadia. You can be in the Battle of Septimus III. You can be there. Well, maybe not Septimus III. Maybe not that one. But you can be there. You can be there. You can stand next to General Martok. You can stand next to General Kachang. And, you can be part of the event. And, particularly for young people who weren't necessarily old enough to join. Although Klingons weren't necessarily great when it came to vetting recruits. But it's another matter. Did an enormous amount to show the war effort and give people a real perspective and understanding of what was going on, and that has a lot of benefits besides just the actual propaganda effort. It actually helped people understand what these soldiers were going through. The Klingons that were demobilized after the war found it a lot easier to reintegrate with the civilian world than Starfleet officers did, because there wasn't this sort of comprehensive understanding. For a lot in the Federation, the war was still very far away, even if there was a lot of media showing it. There was only so much they could show, and there was only so much that they could convey about the war, as most people continue to live their lives relatively normally. Whereas in the Klingon Empire, there was a much better sort of understanding and empathy for that. So that really concludes our look at how propaganda presented the Dominion War in the various combatants. Information warfare is important, and it is a war. Make no mistake, your information war is just as important as your ground war, and it is a war. It is about selling stories and not selling truth. You can tell all the truth you like, but if your enemy has a better story, he's going to win the information war. So if you want to win the information war, you need to have multiple vectors of attack. Newsreels, public information, art, holofilms. And you need to have a good story to tell, because the truth is just not enough. War leaves no one untouched, and whether they like it or not, journalists are soldiers too. And in war, the first casualty is always truth. Thank you guys for watching, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and I will see you all next time.